You weren't supposed to hear it in a place like this, not between the beeping monitors and the low shuffle of nurses' shoes on polished linoleum, but it came anyway. 3 words that would change everything. Code Serenity Now. Hours before that call, Sarah Donovan sat at her mother's bedside, a decorated major stripped down to nothing but a daughter who couldn't stop time, whispering her goodbyes into the fading breath of the only woman who had ever told her it was okay to take off the uniform. If you agree that no child should have to choose between family and duty, like and subscribe, because what happened in that quiet hospital room is a story about what it really means to serve when the world collides with your heart. Sarah was in her late 20s, but her eyes carried years most people never had to live through. Eyes that had tracked gunfire through sandstorms. Eyes that had memorized the edges of maps no one was supposed to see. Yet in that dim hospital room, all she could focus on was the uneven rise and fall of her mother's chest, the way the oxygen tube hissed as though reminding her that time was running out. She held her mother's hand gently, tracing the wrinkles with her thumb, remembering how those same hands had once guided her across a busy street, clapped the loudest at every school recital, and saluted her at the airport the day she left for her first deployment. The machines made their clinical music, but to Sarah it sounded like a countdown, and for once she didn't have a mission brief to follow or an extraction plan in her back pocket. Just the slow ache of knowing her mother's last sunrise might already be passing. Nurses passed by, some with the kind of professional detachment that comes from seeing too many endings, but one paused long enough to murmur, "She won't hold on much longer." Sarah nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what she already knew deep in her bones. She leaned closer, whispering, "Mom, I'm here. I'm not leaving this time." Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from the weight of promises she'd broken before. Birthdays missed, surgeries postponed, holidays spent on foreign soil instead of at this bedside. And then the phone on her hip buzzed. It was just a vibration at first, a tremor against her uniform pocket, but it felt like an earthquake. Sarah ignored it, kissed her mother's temple, and kept whispering, "It's okay. You can rest now." But the phone wouldn't stop. The third buzz came with a tone reserved for one thing only, an emergency dispatch code she hadn't heard since her last combat tour. She pulled it out reluctantly, eyes already burning with guilt, and when she answered, the voice on the other end cut through the fragile quiet like a blade. "Major Donovan, code Serenity Now." The words made her freeze, her grip tightening around her mother's hand, as if to anchor herself in 2 worlds at once. Her heart raced, because she knew what those words meant, an operation buried so deep in classified files it was never supposed to surface again, a call that existed only for moments when the world tilted toward disaster. But here she was, torn between a mother's final breath and a duty that refused to let her grieve. For a long second she said nothing, listening to both the rasp of her mother's breathing and the sterile calm of dispatch waiting for her response. The walls of the hospital room seemed to close in, each beep of the monitor a reminder that time was slipping from her in 2 directions. She wanted to scream, to tell them she was busy being a daughter, not a soldier, not right now, but the uniform on her back and the oath in her blood didn't allow those words. Instead she whispered into her mother's ear, steadying her voice though her soul was breaking, "I'll be back, Mom. I promise." She squeezed her hand one last time, a salute in flesh and bone, and rose from the chair. The hallway outside felt colder, sharper, as if the hospital itself understood she was walking out not just as a grieving child, but as someone about to be summoned back into the shadows of war. And that's when she saw them, 2 officers in plain clothes but with unmistakable posture, waiting by the elevators, their silence telling her what the call already had. She wasn't going to get to say goodbye. Sarah's footsteps echoed down the sterile hallway, each one dragging her further from the fragile rhythm of her mother's breathing and deeper into the steel grip of a duty that refused to loosen. Outside the hospital doors, the night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that hides storms, and a black SUV idled at the curb, windows tinted, engine humming like a predator waiting for its cue. She slid into the back seat without a word, her uniform jacket clutched tightly against her chest, as though it could shield her from what she'd just left behind. Inside, the air smelled of leather and unspoken orders. The driver glanced at her through the mirror, gave a curt nod, and pulled away. No questions. No condolences. Just mission. As the city lights blurred by, Sarah's mind slipped backward, unbidden, to the first time she had ever heard the phrase Code Serenity. It was in a war zone so deep in shadows it barely existed on any map, a night raid where silence was survival and hesitation meant body bags. Back then, she had been a captain, younger, sharper, leading a unit through hostile terrain under radio blackout. The op had gone south. Ambushes from nowhere, civilians caught in crossfire, her men bleeding in the dirt. Code Serenity had been the last resort call, the desperate failsafe that meant, everything is collapsing. Burn the plan, save who you can, and make sure someone makes it out to tell the story. She had used it once, only once, and the ghosts of that night still followed her, not in nightmares but in the way she never let herself sleep too deeply. And now, years later, the code had found her again. Only this time she wasn't in desert camo or jungle fatigues. She was in a hospital, holding her dying mother's hand. The weight of that truth pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. In the SUV, she stared out at the passing city, neon lights blinking like artificial stars, and wondered how many more promises she'd break tonight. At headquarters, the world shifted. The hum of fluorescent lights, the buzz of electronics, the clipped voices of men and women too young to remember the war she carried. All of it slammed into her senses as she walked into the operations center. Conversations faltered when they saw her. Some looked relieved, others skeptical. To them she was barely 30, a major whose service record was classified, so deep most assumed it was exaggerated. But Sarah didn't need their belief. She had the scars, visible and invisible, and the code still ringing in her ears. She stood tall, though the ache of leaving her mother felt like a blade twisting in her chest. A lieutenant with nervous eyes handed her a folder. "Major, the situation's volatile. We've never triggered Serenity before, but command said you'd know what to do." His tone held a question he didn't dare ask aloud. "Why you?" Sarah didn't answer him. Instead, she flipped open the folder, scanning intel reports, maps, threat matrices, all while the room held its breath. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was precision, the kind earned from years of living where a pause could save or end lives. Finally, she looked up, her voice steady but carrying the weight of someone who had whispered goodbye only minutes earlier. "This isn't about command," she said. "This is about survival. If Serenity's been called, it means we don't get second chances. So listen carefully." Her words cut through the chatter like a clean blade. Young officers straightened. Doubt shifted into reluctant focus. But not everyone was convinced. From the far side of the table, a colonel, older, sharper, with the swagger of someone used to holding court, leaned back in his chair. "With respect, Major," he said coolly, "you just walked in from a hospital room. Are you sure you're fit to lead an operation tonight?" The question stung, not because it doubted her skill, but because it pressed on the wound she was already bleeding from. For a heartbeat, the room waited for her to falter. But Sarah didn't. "Fletch." She met his eyes and replied, voice quiet but edged with steel. "I know what loss feels like, Colonel. That's why none of you are going to feel it tonight." Silence fell like a dropped flag. Even the hum of the monitors seemed to hush, as though the building itself was bracing for what she was about to unleash. Sarah set the folder down, spread the map across the table, and began assigning positions with a precision that cut through every ounce of doubt. And in that moment, the grief of a daughter transformed into the resolve of a soldier, because if she couldn't save her mother, she would damn well save everyone else. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of servers and the scratch of pens against paper, but inside Sarah Donovan's chest the war drums were already pounding, a rhythm that had never really left her since her first tour. Only buried under medals and silence, and now, summoned back by the three words that had stolen her from her mother's bedside. Around the operations table, young officers leaned in, their faces caught between skepticism and awe, watching a woman not much older than themselves seize the room with the kind of authority you couldn't fake, the kind forged in fire, sharpened in loss, and carried into every step she took. She pointed to the map, her hand steady though her heart still trembled with grief, outlining movements, contingencies, fallback routes, her voice cutting through the fog of uncertainty with precision. "You'll cover the south corridor. If they breach there, They own us in under 5 minutes. She turned to another. Don't wait for permission. If you see the signal flare move, do not ask, do not hesitate. Serenity doesn't leave room for doubt. The words carried weight because she wasn't quoting doctrine. She was quoting survival. And in the silence that followed, even the colonel who had questioned her earlier shifted uneasily, realizing too late that this wasn't a major distracted by grief. This was the only person in the building who had walked through Serenity and lived. The mission unfolded not in a blaze of cinematic heroics, but in the quiet, terrifying efficiency of people finally listening, finally realizing that their lives rested on every word she spoke. From the command center, Sarah tracked the pieces in motion like a conductor pulling music from chaos. Every radio check a heartbeat, every confirmation a thread holding the fragile fabric of survival together. Outside the compound, boots struck pavement, drones buzzed overhead, and the night split open with the urgency of men and women moving into positions they barely understood. But Sarah understood, because she had already bled through the blueprint years ago in a place where names were erased and bodies were buried without headlines. And when the first breach alert came, an echo on the radar, a shadow slipping past the perimeter, panic surged in the younger officers. But Sarah's voice steadied the room. Hold your line. They're probing, not striking. Wait. Now. And with that single command, the ambush collapsed. The enemy cornered before they even realized their cover was blown. The colonel, once so sure of his authority, stood frozen, watching as the major he had doubted turned what could have been catastrophe into control, her grief honed into clarity sharper than any doctrine he'd ever quoted. The operation stretched for hours, each minute a test of will, of trust, of whether her voice alone could keep the weight of disaster from crushing them all. And she carried it, not with bravado but with the quiet strength of someone who had already said goodbye once tonight and refused to let anyone else taste that same bitter loss. Finally, when the last confirmation came, all clear, targets secured, no casualties, the room exhaled as one, a release of fear so heavy it felt like the walls themselves sighed. Sarah set down her headset slowly, her hands trembling only once it was over, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, as though breaking the silence would shatter the fragile miracle they'd just lived through. Then, slowly, applause rose, not thunderous, but reverent, an acknowledgement not of a commander with stripes on her shoulders, but of a daughter who had carried them all through the fire while her own heart was breaking. The colonel approached her, his face pale, his eyes downcast. "Major," he began, voice low, "I misjudged you." But Sarah cut him off with a single glance, calm but unyielding. "You don't have to apologize to me. Just make sure you never doubt another soldier again when lives are on the line." He nodded, chastened, and stepped back. Only then did she allow herself to remember where she had come from tonight, the room she had left, the promise she had whispered. She walked out of headquarters alone, the night air sharp against her skin, and drove back to the hospital in silence, each streetlight passing over her windshield like a tally of minutes she could never reclaim. When she reached her mother's floor, the hallway was quiet, too quiet, and the moment she stepped through the door she knew. The bed was still, the monitors dark, her mother's hand folded gently across her chest. Sarah froze, her uniform suddenly heavier than ever, the metals on her jacket feeling like anchors pulling her into the floor. On the bedside table was a folded note, the kind of note written by someone who knew their daughter too well, who knew she wouldn't be there at the final moment, not because she didn't care, but because duty would call her away one last time. With shaking hands, Sarah opened it, her eyes blurring as she read the words. "Daughters of soldiers never choose between family and duty. They carry both. I am proud of you." The paper trembled in her grip as tears finally broke free, silent but relentless, streaking down the face of a soldier who had led men through darkness but couldn't stop time for the woman who had given her life. She pressed the note to her chest, leaned down, and kissed her mother's forehead, whispering, "Rest now, Mom. Mission complete." And then she did something she had never done in uniform before. She saluted, not to a flag, not to a superior officer, but to her mother, steady and solemn, the final act of a daughter who had been both soldier and child in a single night. Outside the hospital window, the dawn broke quietly, painting the sky in pale gold. And though the world moved on as if nothing had changed, everyone who had been in that operations room tonight would carry the memory of Major Sarah Donovan forever. Not just as the soldier who saved them, but as the daughter who taught them that service is not about rank or recognition, but about love strong enough to answer two calls at once, even when it breaks your heart.